Good evening. I'd like to call to order the December 1st, 2021 Planning Commission meeting. Let's go ahead with the approval of minutes for the October 2021 meeting.
I move we approve the minutes as presented.
I second.
Okay, we have a motion to approve as presented by Commissioner Granson, a second by Commissioner Saldivar. Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. Motion passes unanimously. Do we have any interested citizens? Hirsch, you got anything to tell us tonight? No. All right, go Ducks.
Here to listen to you guys.
Sounds good. We are in a little bit of a delay due to traffic issues, so I'm going to go ahead and move over to the new old business staff report. Shane, if you've got anything, or Dina, or for that matter, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Chair Lawyer. Hot mic. I got the hot mic tonight. All right. So yeah, I'll talk about it. Just a few things. Since our last meeting, 7-Eleven opened. So that was kind of like a big deal. You know, they got up and running, the traffic signal operating. So that was great. And I think, I don't know if they had moved to dirt the last time, but I know I kind of had given planning commissioners a heads up about the Herber property up on Chemawa and Verda. There's been some dirt removal that happened there. They needed to remove some soil because of some former farming practices that were done there. And actually Debbie and I were just talking about it, and they've done some hydroseeding for erosion control purposes. That project is moving forward slowly but surely. We haven't seen any actual applications or anything like that. However, I have had a meeting with the developer here just recently talking about site planning and kind of where they're planning to put businesses, buildings. If you may or may not know, but it was a comprehensive plan and zone change was done, I think in 2016 is when it was completed. The order was actually adopted. The property used to be zoned residential. It is now zoned medium density and is slated for, I believe, 112 units of multifamily, as I think what the cap was on the order. So that, I know the developer is excited to be moving forward with that project. And that should start happening sooner than later. So kind of giving you the heads up. If you have questions on, hey, what's going on with the dirt? Well, nothing quite yet, but yes, there is movement on that property and it is being developed. I'll give you a couple of other kind of planning related updates. Nothing that is necessarily like instantly upon you for decisions or anything like that. But I am part of a rules advisory committee for climate friendly and equitable communities. It's looking at transportation and kind of housing rules and how cities do planning moving forward, specifically in relation to greenhouse gas reduction targets identified by the governor's office. And today I had 2 meetings regarding kind of the ongoing work that the state is doing. And of important note, just kind of give you a heads up as planning commissioners, there's a ton of information on the Department of Land Conservation and Development's webpage, DLCD, regarding CFEC, climate friendly and equitable communities. And I would encourage you all to kind of take a little bit of look. It's not light reading. I will warn you that. It's not light reading for me. I don't think it's light reading for anyone. You know, one of the ongoing comments made in our meetings with other entities and communities around the state is, we're not sure we totally understand all of this, so can you clarify this? And then sometimes it's like, well, we're not totally sure we understand it either. But the big thing is there's going to be some changes proposed to the rules, which will change the way that we do some of our transportation planning stuff in the future. And one of the most kind of, I think, impactful things to us as a community is that in the fairly near future, we will be required, if the rules pass as they're written, we will be required to identify what are called climate-friendly areas, or a climate-friendly area. The good news is I think that a lot of the work we did in our River Cherry overlay district will kind of double for that. However, there are some concerns I have with some of the standards the state is proposing with dimensional standards to the areas. And basically what they're talking about is in those areas, a higher level of density, higher level of walk, bike, transit service, basically less cars. The rules as a whole are designed to reduce those vehicle miles traveled by folks, get people out of cars and into alternate modes to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions by light vehicles, passenger cars. One of the things that the state is looking at doing is Keizer and Salem are a group. We're going to share GGB, obviously. So actually having to do some scenario planning in the next couple of years, which will have us kind of have to look at different ways our community might look in the future. So I'll be keeping y'all posted on that. And really the point of me bringing it up here is just, it wouldn't be a bad thing for you to kind of look at some of those items around the climate friendly and equitable communities page on DLCD's site to familiarize yourself with some of that work that's being done. I think that as we are looking at this House Bill 2001 stuff and the project we're doing, some of the same things that are being required of us right now, it's a similar thread. Things like reducing parking, things like allowing market factors to drive certain development and allow easier access for, House Bill 2001 specifically for housing, but in this case, it's more than just the housing element. So anyway, Shen goes to way too many meetings regarding that subject right now, but kind of want to have you sharing my pain a little bit. So that I kind of wanted to give you guys a heads up on. The other element with that, and I guess this is a public meeting, it's on TV, well, I could get in trouble for that, but whatever. I think one of the other elements, we've talked about our transportation system plan as a whole, and that it's something that we kind of would like to update sooner rather than later. In looking at the way the rules are being written and where funding streams come from for grants, I think it might be that our transportation system plan update might have to wait until after some of the scenario planning work is done in the next couple of years. So anyway, the other thing I'll bring up is I also sit on a committee actually with Hirsch regarding Wheatland Road. We're doing a project right now for a planning project for Wheatland Road specifically, a multimodal plan. Bill Loyer, our Public Works Director, is really kind of the head honcho on that. I just kind of sit as part of the advisory committee. So that's another project that's been exciting as it looks at reimagining what Wheatland Road maybe would look like. I can't remember when they come back. But we've had a couple of online open houses for that and had some good responses from the community. And again, I would encourage you kind of familiarize yourself with that project. We should be getting some preferred alternative stuff out of that, and ultimately the design will be being adopted at council. I don't know that it will come to Planning Commission formally or not, but it may end up coming to you as well. But I will keep you posted on that. But just kind of some exciting projects that are being worked on that hopefully can get built down the road. And then the other thing is obviously tonight's meeting, we're going to be talking about the House Bill 2001 stuff. And I think the consultant's going to hit on this if they show up. But one thing I wanted to kind of check in with all of you is in the packet that we sent out of my staff report, I sent a link to our online open house that the consultant's hosting. I would encourage you all to go on, walk through it, do the survey yourselves, and help us get the word out to as many people as we can. I think when I checked in with the consultant on Monday or Tuesday, I can't remember which, I was gone yesterday, but I think it might have been while I was gone yesterday. I think he had said that we had had 157 views of the open house or somewhere around that. And I think 60 survey responses or 58 survey responses or something. Do you remember what those numbers were, Dana? So I thought that was great for especially over a Thanksgiving holiday weekend. So hopefully all of you did the survey. If not, please do the survey because I think that will help with informing especially some of the policy things that we want to talk with you about tonight. The other thing we sent out to you was that big, long code audit document. And I know that the consultant is intending to kind of walk through some of those findings, but since we're waiting for them, and I know this isn't totally the norm, but I figured if you all have questions on any of that, I can do my best to try to kind of answer some of those for you while we're waiting. So yeah, I mean, I'd go ahead.
Procedurally, shouldn't we wait until we open the public record for that?
There's no public.
There's no
there's no
hearing.
public-
It's,
okay.
and that's actually the other thing, so obviously this is a planning commission meeting. And I know we talked about this at the last meeting, and Shannon, you jump in and correct me or slap me if I'm wrong. But remember with this project that we're doing for House Bill 2001, you as a planning commission, I mean, yes, you're a planning commission, but we're not functioning, at least tonight, as a recommending or adopting body. You're really functioning as a technical advisory committee for the project. And oftentimes when we do these projects, a technical advisory committee, we would have a planning commission member or maybe two, maybe a city councilor, generally people from the greater community or whatever, you'd have a group of people on a technical advisory committee. But in this case, because so many of the things are so prescriptively based that we have to adopt them, we talked to the state about, can we simply use the planning commission meeting forum as a means of having a technical advisory committee? All the meetings are open to the public, so anybody can show up, which is kind of nice, and they were absolutely supportive of that. So yes, go for it.
I was going to ask you, did anyone else do that too? Were we the first or what?
I don't know because I think there were some others that didn't do a technical advisory committee at all because they were doing the updates in-house. So they weren't necessarily grant funded. So most of the grant funded projects though, they did have some variations. I know that, and actually our consultant could probably speak to this better because they've done these for multiple jurisdictions, but I don't think we might be the only community that's doing it exactly like this. So
The Kaiser way.
that's right.
So Shane, something occurred to me.
Yeah.
I'm sorry it didn't come to me beforehand, but this is kind of a first look at this cross, for lack of a better word, cross road of the code and whether or not it fits within the requirements of House Bill 2001. And we're not expected to make any recommendations on this tonight, correct?
Correct.
Are we going to get a second look at this? And the only reason I ask that question is because I think it's really important for the Planning Commission to hear what the community has said at large. And I think that, I'm big on public process. I'm big on making sure we're hearing from the community. And I would not feel comfortable personally making any recommendations or any suggestions, frankly, without hearing what the community at large has said on the survey.
Sure. No, and I absolutely understand that, Chair Lawyer. I think that for tonight, two things. The audit of the code is just that.
Right.
It's an audit. It's really it doesn't matter and not that the general public's opinion doesn't matter, but the reality is that, okay, here's what the statute says, here's what our code says,
Okay. Does
it meet it or not? So that's a piece that's really being provided as much as anything for a level of understanding. Those areas, and the consultant and I talked about this at length, and it is hard. We're in a very compressed timeline to get all of this work done. So I know the consultant is already working on some draft language in those areas where, okay, this is prescriptive, we're gonna have to do these changes. We already know the code doesn't meet it, so where and how do we change that and format it to make it work? So they're already kind of doing that work behind the scenes. We're not bringing you that yet for consideration because it's not ready for prime time, so to speak. I think the areas that we do want to get some input tonight, and actually city attorney and I have talked about this a little bit, there are some areas that they've identified in this audit where there's some room for some policy kind of considerations for Planning Commission to hear on. Now, those same policy considerations are those areas that we're asking those questions in that survey about as well. So I think that it would be helpful to our consultant and myself tonight to hear some of your initial reactions. Again, not holding you to anything, but to hear some of the initial reactions at least. And if there are certain elements where there's a clear consensus of the Planning Commission that, hey, we feel this way unless, the public tells us otherwise, that would be helpful for us to give us direction as we start drafting actual language so that when we come back in future meetings with, hey, here's language and here's how this works, then that's where you would get into deliberation and all of those kinds of things. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, to a degree, but again, I think it's still important that I don't want the public process and the public survey piece to be just a matter of course. I think it's important to myself as a commissioner, and I don't want to speak for the others, but one of the things we do really well in Keizer is getting community input. And if we don't have that and we start sort of taking you down a path that maybe the community said, no, you're going down the wrong way, then frankly, it's a waste of your time.
Sure.
So I just want to be thoughtful about that as we're kind of looking towards those things, right?
Yeah, and for what assurances I can give from my end, I'm also very mindful of that. Our consultant is very mindful of that. So really the plan is to basically leave that open house open. I think we're looking at December 20th maybe when we will kind of shut that down. We kind of send out Facebook posts, a mass email. We're going to do that again. Actually, I think we're going to do that again this week. We're going to send out a reminder and we're going to kind of continue to try to get that word out. I'm going to actually make some phone calls to some other folks because we've emailed them, but I want to also verbally get that before them. So we're going to hopefully see responses. And like I said, I was encouraged by the number of responses that we got over this first week of it being up, especially considering Thanksgiving and the weekend and shopping and all of those things that were going on. But yeah, I definitely hear where you're coming from as far as, especially in those policy consideration areas. I would not expect Planning Commission to just go, oh yeah, let's go that route immediately without hearing back. So, and that's where the hope would be we would have that feedback loop from those folks that filling out those surveys and other comments that we're getting.
Well, I would just encourage our local neighborhood newspaper to pick this up, run a big column on it, and, encourage folks to take the survey and continue to get that outreach done. So that's all I've got on that particular issue.
All right.
Any other thoughts or comments from the commission? No? That's all you got, right?
I don't have anything else to really talk about for all the new business.
Let's talk to Counselor.
Actually, we do have one other thing.
Okay.
That's a good idea. No, that's a good.
And you can chime in.
Yep.
So on a totally unrelated note, just to fill time, on something that's not truly a land use matter, but has to do with marijuana. So our marijuana shops in town are regulated by a non-land use ordinance. There is a small section of the land use ordinance about where they can be located generally, but we have a distance requirement in our non-land use permitting ordinance. It requires shops to be 1,000 feet away from each other. And we have a section in the ordinance that was well written by your city attorney that has this date stamp process for somebody. We were worried when they first put it in that what if two people come in almost at the same time, but they're within 800 feet of each other? And so we have this date stamp process for the application to take precedent, et cetera. For those of you who might have noticed, the shop that's called Cush on the corner of Dearborn and River Road's been closed for some time. I don't want to speculate. We've heard all sorts of stories about that, but they ran into some sort of problems with the state, I think. So that's been closed for a while, and they lost their license, and so that location doesn't have the permit anymore. Well, somebody from what I call the Kaiser Nursery, is that the right name for it? If you know where Kaiser Nursery is, they have come in and submitted and got a license for their shop, which is about 850 feet away from Cush. The Cush attorney had talked to me quite some time ago and had kept asking me, has anybody applied anywhere else? No. Has anybody applied anywhere else? No. We're still working on our end. They came in first. And so now we have a little debate, and they've submitted, the people for Cush have submitted a letter requesting that the council consider amending the ordinance to, I think, 750 feet. And that's on the agenda for initial consideration at this meeting on December 6th. Just kind of an update for you. It'll be kind of an interesting thing. They have, to really put in extreme shorthand, a pretty good sob story in terms of why it happened. The state just moves extremely slowly, so they've been working on this thing for over a year with the state to get the license. We don't issue a permit or even accept a permit until you have your state license. Right. So they felt pretty well stuck. So, and the timing was excellent. I finished my unrelated story just in time for our consultant, so I'll turn it back over to Shane.
Well, we didn't put this time up in smoke, so that was good. That was the worst pun I can come up with, sorry.
It's great. All right, well, so with no further ado, Matt Hasty, who you all met at our last meeting with Angela Planning Group, and then Brandon Crawford is here tonight. You didn't meet him before, but he's also here, and so they're going to be chatting with you guys and kind of walking through that code audit, and I will just turn it over to them and let them go.
All right, and my apologies for being late. I left even earlier this time, and yet we were later. Do not listen to Google when it tells you to take a detour off of I-5. That's what I learned tonight. I'll never do that again. Anyway, so I apologize for being late, but thanks for having us and thanks for your patience. And so we're going to walk through a presentation. Won't repeat much of the last meeting. Kind of just talk about where we are on the project, review the results of the code audit that we've done that we sent out in advance, kind of do that at a high level and go through it reasonably quickly. I would say just let us know if you have questions and we'll answer the questions. Anything I can't answer, I'll punt over to Brandon, all the hard ones he gets. And so we'll be happy to answer questions on anything in there. There are a few items we want to spend a little more time discussing, which is what we identified here and in the presentation as policy options. So those are places where you all as a community have a little more flexibility in kind of how you handle and implement the requirements associated with HB 2001 and the administrative rules and also Senate Bill 458. So that's where we'll have some more sort of opportunity for discussion. But just along the way, just do interrupt me, let me know if you have questions as we're presenting information. We'll give you just kind of a quick update on the online open house and survey that's active now, and then just kind of finish up with next steps and let you go. So that's the plan. Any questions for me before we get started? All right, thank you. So this is just kind of a recap of the same schedule graphic that I showed you last time we were here, with just the movement of the little "We Are Here" star. So we finished the work on the code audit, and we'll talk more about that. Next steps are to go through and identify amendments to the draft code. Again, tonight we'll talk about some of those places where there's some policy choices or options for you all to get some guidance to inform what we do on the code update piece itself. We'll come back to you at your meeting in January to talk about kind of a first batch of code amendments and have you review the recommendations there, and then come back again in February for a second batch. It's going to be a lot of stuff, so we don't want to do it all at once. Combine all that with the guidance you've given us at those two meetings, come back in March, and then go through the adoption process, essentially kind of March through early May. So that's kind of where we are and what we have coming out there in the next few months. So just kind of a quick overview of what we did in the code audit itself and what kinds of things we were looking at just generally, and then we'll walk through some of the details there. One, just making sure that your comprehensive plan policies and your development code are consistent with each other, and then also consistent with the standards and requirements of House Bill 2001 and the associated administrative rules. And then looking specifically at which residential zones currently allow mental housing, which don't, and where will that need to be allowed in the future. Look specifically at a whole series of standards, siting standards and design standards, lot size, building height, setbacks, off-street parking requirements, all those sorts of things. So that's kind of what I'll spend the next few slides walking through. Also looked at what are the development review procedures you currently apply to mental housing types, and how does that sync up also, again, with those administrative rules and the legislation. And then spend some time looking at the requirements of Senate Bill 458, which has to do with what are called mental housing land divisions, and what kinds of updates to your code are we going to need to look at there to be consistent with those requirements, and what are some of the things we know we're going to need to look at, what might be some choices there. So there's not a lot of choices on that one. It's pretty prescriptive. It's more about figuring out how to weave that into your development code, both in terms of the procedures and standards. So that's what we did in that code audit memo. We'll just kind of start out with kind of where are you currently consistent, and there's a number of ways in which your code's already consistent with the requirements. First, almost all of your residential zones already allow most of the mental housing types outright, with the exception of cottage cluster housing. It's allowed as a conditional or special use in most of those zones. The exception is the RS zone. It does not allow all of those mental housing types. So that's the one that kind of needs the most revision in terms of allowing those mental housing types. Your RH or high density zone, it complies with also the lot size and density requirements for plexes, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes. So we won't have to make any changes to those standards around that. And then similarly, you already comply with or are consistent with some of the setback, height, and lot coverage requirements for mental housing types in your residential zones. So that's another area where you're pretty good to go, with the exception of cottage clusters. So, and that's really partly because of just not allowing them in certain places. So that's kind of just an overall where you're already in good shape, and where we won't have to make changes. So just in terms of applicability, right now, you'll need to allow mental housing outright in each residential zone. So we just kind of listed the zones there. That includes your mixed-use zone because you allow single-family detached housing in that zone. That then becomes essentially a residential zone where you also have to apply HB 2001. We can talk more about that later. If you did not allow that as an outright permitted use, you could allow it as a non-conforming use, but if you didn't, then you wouldn't have to apply it in that zone. But currently you do. Same thing with portions of the River Cherry Overlay District where the base zone applies, or where HB 2001 applies to the base zones within the overlay zone, you also have to be consistent with those HB 2001 and administrative rule requirements. And we just noted that cottage cluster is not currently allowed outright in any zone, so that's just something we're going to have to address kind of in all those zones. So there's going to be a lot of words on the next few slides. Yeah.
So before we move past that,
Yes.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the retail commercial, or the residential commercial zone. Looking through the pamphlet, there's information that I was sent out. You guys determined that that was not going to be subject to HB 2001. Have you guys vetted that through anybody, DLCD or anybody?
So we did copy, we've got a couple folks at DLCD who are kind of involved in reviewing our work on this process, and we did copy them with the work we did. Both somebody in the housing group, Sean Edging, I think is the planner at DLCD assigned from the housing group to this project, and then the regional representative is also assigned to look at this one. And I'm pretty sure we did get at least some quick feedback from Sean, which was it's looking good. I think he had I want to say he had one or two specific comments.
Sean's actually the one who informed us that mixed use would apply. So we talked about mixed use and residential commercial kind of in the same area in the audit. So I'm pretty sure he definitely had his eyes on it. So I think he would have flagged that if he recognized that residential commercial did apply.
Okay.
And yeah, initially we didn't think mixed use would apply, but he informed us that DLCD interprets mixed use that allows residential as a residential zone, so.
Okay.
Yep, there's sort of a, if this and that, then this. And in the case of the mixed use zone, we had interpreted it more as, well, it's not implementing directly a residential comp plan designation, but because it's mixed use, it allows for both residential and commercial, and it does allow for single family detached. DLCD's interpretation is that applies. The residential commercial, I think they don't look at it quite the same way. And so it sounds like they're saying, yeah, you're okay. They did find the one zone where, no, you need to update that. And then the only other thing I'd say is Sean's the one that's gonna have the most sort of knowledge specifically of the HB 2001 requirements. And the regional rep for you all, she's brand new to DLCD. She just took over that position a couple weeks ago, and I don't think that she actually had a chance to look through this stuff in detail. But Sean would generally be picking up on this stuff, and he definitely did look at the document. So, good question. And we'll definitely we're always going to copy Sean with the stuff that we send out, and all of our folks in the housing group are pretty good about reviewing and being responsive, and I think and they'll attend meetings if they're virtual too. They won't always attend them in person, but they've been a good resource. Yeah, good question.
And I would just chime in to Commissioner Grenz. I think the difference is that in that RC zone, we do allow housing, but it's subject to being in conjunction with a business. It says one house per business per lot. And there's no provision to allow just housing or just a single family home to be developed. And so this House Bill 2001 was really geared towards those residential zones where single family homes are allowed, because we did have some back and forth with Sean at DLCD as well. And the difference being is in the mixed use zone, the way we define it is we say one or more buildings with one or more dwelling units in them. So basically the whole parameter of housing is outright allowed in the mixed use zone. So anyway, I think that's why the differentiation was there, because frankly, I think most places around the state, a lot of times they're not putting HB 2001 standards in the mixed use zone, because focused on commercial, multifamily, things like that, and single families aren't allowed outright. So that is somewhat unique to our mixed-use zone, and something we may want to consider as we move forward.
Yeah, I really only ask, you guys are the professionals, you're in this all day. I just, looking at the comp plan, the zone code, I think I could make a pretty good argument, but.
Yeah, it's a
Very
totally
great.
fair question, and I think I would echo what Shane said, is that a lot of communities have excluded their mixed use or higher density zones where they don't allow single family detached as an outright use. And so HB 2001 doesn't apply in those areas, even if they allow other types of housing, so, yeah. All right, so these next couple slides are kind of busy, so I'm just kind of warning you up front on that. And the next few slides sort of summarize or paraphrase a bunch of stuff in the Code Audit memo. So I'll kind of go through these, but again, if you have questions, let us know, or let me know, and we'll do our best to answer them. So here we're talking about lot size. So the requirements for lot size in the administrative rules are that duplexes, the minimum lot size needs to be no larger than the minimum lot size for single family detached homes. So it basically needs to be the same, or you could let it be lower, but generally it ends up being the same. For triplexes and quadplexes, the minimum lot size depends in part on what the minimum lot size is for single family detached. So if the minimum lot size, existing minimum lot size for single family is less than 5,000 square feet, then it's basically, you can't have a minimum lot size of greater than 5,000 square feet. If the minimum lot size is greater than 5,000 square feet, then you can't have a minimum lot size that's greater than whatever the standard is for single family detached. So similar for quadplexes and cottage clusters. For quadplexes, it's the same thing, but with a 7,000 square foot threshold. Same idea, same approach. And then pretty much the same for cottage clusters. If single family detached minimum lot size is 7,000 feet or greater, you can't exceed the single family detached lot size. Generally, it's 7,000 square feet is sort of the minimum lot size for cottage clusters in most residential zones, unless you've got a pretty high minimum lot size. Townhouses, it's kind of a dual standard, either 1,500 square feet or less, or up to 4 times the density allowed for single family detached, but it doesn't have to be greater than 25 units per acre. So it's a little, it's kind of a combined average minimum lot size and density. The other middle housing types in the administrative rules are not really a density requirement. It's all kind of formulated or based on minimum lot sizes, not average density. But they look at it a little differently for townhouses. Again, kind of a dual thing. So in terms of where you're already consistent, for the plexes, really only in the RH zone. In your other zones, your minimum lot sizes are greater than those amounts, either absolutely or in relation to single family detached in your other residential zones and your mixed use zone. Cottage cluster has a pretty high minimum lot size in all zones, so it doesn't comply in any of those zones with that 7,000 square foot minimum. Same townhouses also, not consistent with these standards. So basically, in all those places, we're going to have to make some adjustments in terms of being consistent with those lot size requirements. Density, I kind of said this a little bit before, but for most middle housing types, what the rules say is you can't apply a maximum density, and the idea there is so that you don't end up with conflicts between a comp plan density and the density that you're applying within your code. And really the density is all about the minimum lot size. That equates to a density. So the standards are associated with minimum lot size, they equate to a density, but you can't also separately apply a maximum density for those housing types in those zones. So you don't have a maximum density except in, you don't have maximum density in the RH zone, so no problem there. But I think there are in some of the other zones, so we'll, again, have to look at that. Cottage clusters, within the definition of cottage clusters in the legislation, there was a minimum density of 4 units per acre, and you're good with that in the RL and the RH zones, but not in the RS. And then for townhouses, you comply in the RH zone, but not in the other ones. And again, it's kind of an either or standard there in terms of the lot size or the density, you know, so there we've got some options for how we apply it. I'm gonna stop right there and just see if anybody has any questions about the lot size stuff. There's a lot of kind of, I guess, nuance and between lot size, density, et cetera, but any questions before I keep going? All right, cool. So some other requirements, setback requirements. Again, we'll talk about kind of what the rules say and then what your code says. The rules say that for plexes, duplex, triplex, quadplex, you need to apply essentially the same setbacks that you do for single family detached. You could apply a lower setback, but you can't have a bigger setback. Cottage cluster, it's sort of the same thing, except that for the perimeter setbacks, so around the edge of the property, assuming you've got, you know, multiple cottages on one lot, there's a maximum perimeter setback of 10 feet. And then for townhouses, you need to apply essentially the same or less setback as you do for single family detached homes. But of course, because those homes are attached to each other, you can have a 0 foot, you know, side yard setback where they're attached. So in terms of kind of where you comply, for duplexes, you're consistent in the RH, the MU, and the River Cherry Overlay District. For triplexes and quadplexes, you're consistent in the RH, but not in the other zones. Cottage clusters doesn't comply, and townhouses doesn't. Again, you've got some different setbacks for those. Some of that has to do with you've got some standards that are kind of related to some side yard standards that are a little unique, and that's what's sort of, that's what's resulting in the non-compliance. Like the front and rear setbacks are fine. It's just some of those side yard setbacks in certain areas. So there's actually kind of less work to do there, or less inconsistency than it might appear from this slide, I think. Design standards, basically the requirement is for duplexes, you really need to apply essentially the same design standards that you apply to single family detached. For other middle housing, generally similar, you can apply less restrictive standards than what you apply to single family detached generally, but not more restrictive ones. And/or you can apply certain design standards that are identified in the state's middle housing model code. Those relate specifically to the orientation of entrances to homes, to kind of the where those are related to the front of the building or the side of the building, percentage of windows on the front facade of the building, and then there are some design standards related to kind of location and width of driveways and access to parking areas. And then for townhouses, there's some additional design standards that are in the model code. So you can apply any or all of those or none of them. And then beyond that, it gets a little fuzzier, and we'll talk about that a little later. But that's generally kind of what the design standard requirements are. So in terms of compliance, you're good on duplexes. You don't need to make any changes there. But you apply design standards for multifamily housing that's defined as 3 or more units. So that includes triplexes and quadplexes, and townhomes that are 4 or more units. And so some of those design standards are not consistent with those model code design standards I mentioned, and/or they are beyond what you apply to single family detached. So those we're gonna have to definitely, there's a couple options there. One, redefine multifamily, so it's 5 or more units, and so those design standards then wouldn't apply to triplexes and quadplexes. Some combination of looking at that and looking at applying a different, probably kind of narrower set of design standards than what you currently apply to those housing types. So those are the options we're gonna end up kind of, I think, looking at based on what you have now in your code and kind of what the requirements say. So, questions about that? I know that's kind of a lot. All of these slides are kind of a lot, but all right, well, just again, let me know if you have questions. So off-street parking, always one that gets a lot of attention. There was a lot of discussion of this when the state was putting together the model code and the administrative rules around this. In terms of what the rules say, for duplexes, you can require up to 2 spaces total, so 1 space per unit. Can't require more. You can allow more. If somebody wants to develop something and they want to provide more, that's totally fine. You just can't require more. For triplexes and quadplexes, the number you can require depends on the size of the lot where you allow the triplex or the quadplex. So if you were to choose to allow triplexes or quadplexes on pretty small lots, which you're not obligated to do, but you could do, then on those smaller lots, you cannot require as much off-street parking. So if the lot for the triplex is less than 3,000 square feet, which is quite a small lot for a triplex, only 1 off-street space. If it's between 3,000 and 5,000 square feet, 2 off-street spaces for the whole triplex. Above that, 3 spaces. So then it's kind of the 1 per unit, which is consistent across most of these housing types. Same thing for quadplexes, just the thresholds are a little different, and the thresholds tie back to those minimum lot size thresholds that I talked about earlier. So if you go with, kind of what most, I think, probably most communities do is 7,000 square foot minimum lot size for a quadplex, then you can require up to 4 spaces, 1 per unit for those types of housing. And then townhouses and cottage clusters, 1 space per unit. That's what the rules say. Basically, you require more parking than that for pretty much all these housing types. So none of those are consistent. We're gonna have to look at some changes to those.
Just a quick question.
Yes.
Just for my own info. Why are the number of parking based on lot size, not number of units?
Because it starts to become more difficult to fit the number of units on those smaller lots if you require more parking spaces because of the amount of space it takes for both the parking space itself and for the access to the parking space. So as part of that process of kind of looking at the model code and these administrative rules, and we helped with those, so hopefully you're not upset about that, but we helped with those, and we had an architect or a architect and landscape architect on our team, and they did some test fits where they kind of looked at, for a 3,000 square foot lot, could you fit 3 units and 3 parking spaces for a triplex? What would that end up doing to the sizes of the units, to the lot coverage, and to other standards like that? And then we also had an economist on the team, and they looked at what's that going to do to the cost of building the units and the relative financial feasibility of those units if you have to devote a certain amount of space on the lot to parking. And what we found in those cases was when you get to those pretty small lots and you require more parking, it really becomes prohibitive to be able to build the units. So therefore we varied, we and DLCD varied the number of parking spots you could require on those small lots because of those potential impacts of requiring more parking. It basically means like no one would build. You just kind of couldn't build anything that was going to be like a financially feasible development on those really small lots if you had to have more parking spaces. So I said, well, if a city wants to allow a triplex on a really small lot, then you need to do it in such a way that it's not going to make it totally, prohibitive to actually do the development. So that was a long answer to a pretty straightforward question, but that was kind of the thinking that went into that. Yeah.
So I think this parking's like I'm sorry, it should be on. Yeah, it's an important, I think, issue. So I had a couple of questions on the parking.
Okay.
So if you build a duplex or a triplex or whatever, and it has a garage, is that a parking space?
That would qualify as a parking space.
So they wouldn't have to have a driveway?
I mean, they have to be able to get into the garage, but they wouldn't have to have a driveway necessarily that counted as a parking space. But you could, again.
Okay. So,
And the other thing.
I've just seen some communities where they're building a lot of, multi units like this, and there's no place to park. And, so those cars go someplace, they go on the street in the way of traffic and people and stuff like that. And I just think that, when we're talking, this is a policy, decision for the commission. I mean, we really should look at, we're not Portland, we're not having to have, a triplex on a 3,000, would you have 1,000 or 3,000 square foot lot?
That is one of the
That's
implications.
a pretty small footprint. I guess have to go up quite a ways to get a decent amount of square footage in it. But I think this is really something that we need to talk about, at least trying to stay up on the upper ends of that. Like in a triplex, we know we got 3 families in a triplex, they probably have 3 cars. Let's have a place to park that's inside their property, so.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, fair point.
I want to clarify, so I was thinking the same wavelength. So if they have a garage, you don't have to dedicate necessarily a driveway, correct? But you just said that you could.
Right.
So then you have 2
can't
parking spots.
require more than, you can't require somebody to provide, even at those larger lot size, you can't require them to provide more than 1 space per unit, or the triplex or the quadplex, or the townhouse.
Okay.
So if they're building with a garage, that's presumably going to count as one of their spaces. You can't require them to have a driveway that accommodates a car.
Right.
And count it as a parking space, call it a parking space, and the garage. You also can't require them to have the garage. You can require the parking space, but you can't require the garage.
And one thing I would ask, Matt, and I don't remember, does the state say that a garage has to count as a parking space? We have a weird provision in our code right now where we actually don't count a garage as a parking space for a single family or a duplex, but it's only for those that we don't count it as that.
Yeah, they don't say you have to count a garage, so that's a good question, good point. They're kind of agnostic on that. They don't say you have to count a garage as a parking space. They simply say you can't require more than 1 parking space per unit, and unless, if it's a smaller lot size, but at the sort of the more standard lot sizes, you can't require more than 1 space per unit.
But we can make a policy decision that the garage does not count as a parking place.
Perhaps.
Isn't that what you just said you have in duplexes and?
Well, so currently, our code has a provision in our parking standard. And it says that for off-street parking that we require, and we actually require generally 2 spaces for a house, 2 spaces per dwelling unit, so. On a duplex. So right now, we require 4 for a duplex, unless you're in the River Cherry Overlay District where we have chosen to reduce parking requirements. And that was, I couldn't remember what the House bill and the OERs ended up saying on that. But right now, that applies to single family and duplex. It doesn't apply to what we consider multifamily. So if a multifamily project comes in and they're providing garages, those actually can count for required parking spaces if the garages are large enough. So the other thing to consider, and this kind of gets into the weeds, but Dina and I review building permits for a living and site plans. So we have setback requirements for garage openings, which even, here's the reality.
There's going to be a parking space there.
The reality is they've got to get to that garage, and we require a 20-foot setback from a garage opening to the public street. That way somebody can back out and not run into a neighbor immediately. So presuming we don't change that setback standard, even if the garage space counts and the state says you have to allow a garage space to count, they're gonna have to get that car from the street into the garage, and that actually is big enough to be a parking space. So it's not quite as bad of a reduction in some ways as it might feel to all of us.
Yeah, if you retain that setback standard, you're essentially ensuring that there are gonna be two spaces if there's a garage. Like if there's not a garage, there's still gonna be one space because of the setback. I mean, somebody could put lawn in there, right, I guess, but they could still park a car there unless you don't allow it.
But we can still make the policy change that that's 5,000 square feet on a triplex that requires 3 spaces. So in other words, we could have the policy change where we don't have to allow a triplex on a 3,000 square foot.
Correct.
Yeah, you do
So
not
we
have to
can make
allow
the
a
minimum
triplex
lot
on
be
that.
5,000, which requires 3 spaces.
Correct,
Okay.
yes.
And that would be the other thing that I would point out. I mean, in planning, I know we have some new planning commissioners, so
Sorry.
I can't, no. We just recently modified our minimum lot size for residential single-family dwellings, basically in anticipation of this project. So we used to have a 5,000 square foot minimum lot size for detached single-family dwellings. It is now 4,000 square feet. So the one thing I wanted to also point out to Planning Commission is that this is, the standard for parking is based on what a community chooses to allow. And I believe later on, Mr. Hasty, we'll talk about, there are policy considerations for Planning Commission and the community at large to consider. However, the reality for us in Keizer is that we have to allow, based on our existing adopted lot sizes, single-family homes and duplexes will be allowed on lot sizes of 4,000 square feet, because that's what our lot size is. We do not have the ability or the flexibility to not allow a triplex on a 5,000 square foot lot. That would be the minimum that we have to allow it. You could choose to go lower, but you don't have to. But you do have to allow a triplex on that 5,000 square foot lot. We do have to allow a fourplex on that 7,000 square foot lot. So it kind of puts that, you know, the ORSs kind of have this laundry list of if you're this, then you're this, if you're this, then you're this. So just kind of a reminder of, well, this is what we are currently. We're a 4,000 square foot minimum lot size community. So that means 4,000, 5,000, 7,000, we have to allow. If we choose to go different than that, that is something we could choose to do. So, but Mr. Burson, I appreciate your comment and your thinking is
Well, you said
spot
the
on.
council just changed that though?
Yeah, we've always allowed a 4,000 square foot minimum lot size, but it was limited to 0 lot line dwellings, with the exception of our River Cherry Overlay District where we've reduced lot sizes even further. So it's now, it allows a detached dwelling on that 4,000 square foot minimum. And it just went into effect in November.
Yeah, but good questions, and I think it does point out some of the relationships, right, between some of these standards that we're talking about, and that one choice might affect another choice, or might affect your need to be consistent with some other standards. So it's a good thing for us to be thinking about as we're going through this. And we will talk about some places where you've kind of got some flexibility, and I'll definitely want to get whatever feedback you have to offer me on those things when we get to that point, which isn't too far off in the presentation. So procedures, basically a couple things. One, the requirement is middle housing must be subject to the same approval process as single-family detached housing, and also that you need to apply clear and objective standards to all those types of housing. Really, that's true for all types of housing, that you have to apply what are called clear and objective standards. So in this case, because of how you apply your approval processes, you're not consistent for the middle housing types in terms of how you go through the approval process for them. Each of them is subject to Section 2.315, and I'm gonna have to remind me of kind of how that's different for middle housing than single family. I don't have all this stuff quite numbered.
Sorry, for which one?
For the approval process. What's different about the approval process for middle housing types versus single family detached? I don't remember what those sections say.
I can tell you.
There we go. Even
So right now, a single-family home, there's a specific section in our code that says, hey, here's design standards that you apply, and the approval process is simply a building permit. Multifamily, which again, this kind of harkens back to what was spoken a little earlier. One of the big things for us is we've always considered in Keizer that multifamily is essentially if you've got 3 units in one building, it's multifamily. And so the approval process for a multifamily unit is different. There are public improvement requirements, there is design review process, which we still run really fast, like a building permit, but in the code, it calls out this other design review process, and there's the ability to appeal it and to come to planning commission to request design alternatives and things like that. Whereas single family home is just kind of straightforward, get your building permit, Dina signs off on it, as long as you're providing what you need to provide and you're good to go. So that's kind of why there's the inconsistency.
So it's 2 different processes that are applied to those types of housing. So you need to apply the same process essentially. That doesn't mean all the same standards, but it does mean the same approval process. So that's the issue there. Thank you, Shane.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, so that's a super quick overview of like 30 plus pages of the Code Audit memo. There's a number of things we wanted to talk to you about, which are things where you've got some flexibility or some options, and we wanted to talk through those and just kind of highlight them and get some feedback from you all. So one of them that's a pretty big one is when you define plexes, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes in your code, you have to allow attached forms of those. You can, if you so choose, allow those to be detached units on the same lot. So duplex, triplex, quadplex means 2 units, 3 units, or 4 units on the same lot. And so you can choose whether or not to allow that in just an attached configuration or in an attached or detached configuration. So that's an option you have. Now, yeah.
Well, what's the difference between that and the cottage cluster then?
They can often look very similar, frankly. The difference in terms of the way they're defined by the state and would have to be defined in your code is cottage clusters need to be, there's a bunch of specific requirements associated with cottage clusters. So there's a maximum footprint requirement for cottage clusters that you don't have for triplexes or quadplexes. There is the requirement that they be oriented around a common courtyard. You don't have that same requirement for triplexes and quadplexes, or don't have to. There are a number of other requirements specific to cottage clusters which don't necessarily apply to triplexes and quadplexes. But, you know, the reality is you could have like a set of detached quadplexes if you allowed those that might look real similar to a cottage cluster. And it would just depend on like development applicant comes in. If you allowed a detached quadplex, they could come in and say, I am applying to develop a detached quadplex, not a cottage cluster. Or they could come in and say, I'm applying to develop a 4-unit cottage cluster, but they would have to then meet all the requirements specific to cottage clusters.
But for duplex and triplex, they can actually be a bigger footprint then.
It can be a bigger footprint.
So they could build a bigger duplex.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be oriented around that common courtyard. There's some different standards related to, I mean, the parking standards are similar. Yeah, but there are a number of other standards, and we'll get into those too in a couple of slides related to cottage clusters that wouldn't apply to the detached triplex or quadplex unless you wanted them to.
So I'm assuming too, we've talked with the fire department on these things where they're gonna be informed of it, because it just seems like, you know, the example on top is a lot easier to fight than the example on the bottom. If there was fires in the back of that, or, you know,
Yeah, I mean, we have had some conversations, I've had some conversations with Anne Marie about these new standards coming into play. There are still some kind of question marks out there, frankly, as to how fire code standards apply to residential single-family development versus multifamily structures and commercial. This was actually something that's been, that specific issue was raised, I raised it in writing to the state a year and a half ago, with question marks about that. But, you know, realistically, the building code governs building, and the fire code, what they can apply is what they can apply. And I think, you know, one of the things I would say, and, you know, obviously Matt and Brandon weren't here at the very beginning of our meeting, and, you know, one of the things that was expressed by Planning Commission is, you know, kind of wanting to hear from the community input before they get too big into giving us a lot of directions on policy, which I think is absolutely fair. But I would just kind of also encourage you all, if there are things as we're going through that would be helpful for us to bring you information on that can help inform some of those decisions on these policy areas, I want to hear that too. And so, Mr. Burton, I absolutely hear what you're saying on that. And what I'll do is I'll reach out to the fire district and have another conversation with Chief or with Anne Marie and kind of get some input from them, at least. Try to get at least a little something from them, because I would agree with you that depending on how it's configured, and that's kind of site to site specific, it could come up. We've had some of these come up with detached ADUs where the fire district gets involved and there are some concerns. And so, you know, we had a detached ADU in town last year or maybe a year before. They ultimately ended up, because there was some concerns with distance, they did a residential sprinkler system in it, which was an additional cost, but that was absolutely an acceptable method. And so there may be in some of these situations, like, oh, if they're going to do detached plex and it's in the back and, you know, yada, yada, they may have to do residential sprinkler systems or something along those lines.
Well, and the examples had also the example of stacking them up. And I was just wondering if the fire district on how high they can go, like, I mean, do they have equipment on height?
Sure.
You know, to be able to fight a fire.
My guess is that's not going to be an issue with these, and I just say that because your height limits, unless you allow some pretty tall buildings, for this kind of housing, the height limits are usually, like the state standards are, you gotta allow them to be 35 feet. That's like a, you know, a 3-story single family house. So like, you're probably not gonna get into those issues on height in terms of fire protection. That's just my guess, right? No guarantees. But I would echo what Shane said, and I would also say, if there's questions that we can't answer because they're not clear to us in the administrative rules, DLCD has been really good about providing guidance on those things. They conduct like a monthly forum with representatives of cities and counties around the state and also consultants like us. So they walk through the questions they've been getting and their responses to them. And we can submit those questions like at any time. I think the next forum might be next week. It is next week, it's next Monday. So this is sort of opportune. If we come up with some questions here that we either don't have the answers tonight or we go back and look at the rules and it's not clear to us, then we can email those over to DLCD, and they've been pretty good about answering them during the meetings and or providing written guidance as well. So that's been a good resource to have, and we can definitely do that. So I'd say, yeah, definitely raise any issues or questions. We'll do our best to answer them, but if we can't, there's other folks we can go out and try to get the answers from. So I'll kind of talk about for the detached, we kind of identified some pros and cons of allowing detached plexes versus not allowing them. So I'll kind of walk through those. One, it just provides sort of more options for a developer or builder or homeowner who wants to add another unit to their lot, especially if their lot is like an irregular shape and it's difficult to create a triplex or something in an attached configuration, but they can add another unit, you know, on an L-shaped lot or something. Just gives them a little more flexibility, just generally. It can potentially provide a little more, some more opportunities for home ownership, because then it's easier to own both the house and the land underneath, because in part, those middle housing land divisions require you to allow people to divide those properties either concurrently or after they've developed a quadplex. So if then they're able to divide that, somebody owns the underlying lot or property and the house, there might be some shared ownership or access or easements related to access and things like that. There's still some kind of some challenges, but there's more opportunity for home ownership than there is when all the units are on the same lot and you have to have, and they're in an attached form, and you've got to go through some kind of condominiumization process. So some more opportunities there.
Seems a little contradictory, though. I mean, if you say that you have to have a minimum lot size of 4,000 square feet, and now you've subdivided that, then it in and of itself becomes a 1,000 square foot single lot issue. So now you're not comporting with the standard of the
and
minimum
so that
lot
gets
size.
to sort of one of
I was just looking through all that. I'm like, how in the world
Yeah.
could somebody own one of these missing middle type units if the requirement is to have a 4,000 minimum lot size? I mean, unless you do some sort of land trust thing or something along those lines, I just don't see how it'd be, because
Well, I mean, it's the same way people can own a unit in a condominium, right? Or in a
Well, fair,
kind of larger building.
no, I get that, but I think my point is, if you're splitting the lots, right? If you take
Yeah.
4,000, now you got 1,000, then it doesn't comport. It's
I think
just.
you could still have the ownership option. They can't come along later and like add another unit to that thing. They can't. So once it's approved as a quadplex, even if you split it up, and you got one unit on now a much smaller lot.
Right.
You can't then add on. You can't convert that individual unit to a duplex unless you want to let somebody do it. You don't have to let them add an ADU. But yeah, I mean, it might reduce sort of the desire to own it if it's such a small piece of property. But I think legally you could still have the ownership opportunity. But yeah, whether it's attractive in the marketplace, that's harder for me to say. And I think maybe that's like part of the issue there. Like, is that a reasonable thing from a market perspective to do? And that I can't tell you.
You know, one thing, if I remember sitting here for the last 12 or 14 months, if I remember on our housing study, you know, we have to depend on a lot of infill if we're going to meet even minimum housing increases in Keizer. So some of those things to consider is that there's a lot of lots in Keizer that are fairly large and may have a small street footprint, but go back pretty far, you know, like 75 by 250 foot lots. And it would be impossible for those homeowners to be meeting, if they wanted to do a duplex, because they have a single family home, a ranch, which was very commonly built when Keizer was being built. They have a really large backyard, and so having a detached option would allow infill to go into those into our community, because we do not have swaths of acreage of land that a developer can come and build new townhomes or new quads or new triplexes.
Well, that's already allowed though, right? I mean, we're already doing infill where some of these larger lots, they're splitting the lots and putting homes behind them.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely true. I mean, for the last 20 years, the vast majority of development that we've seen in Keizer would be what would historically be called infill. An existing home out front, they keep it. Sometimes people have to rip down a garage. But I think that Commissioner Saldivar is hitting on something that when you look at the development pattern in West Keizer and Southeast Keizer specifically, you had a lot of lots that were platted, say 50s, 60s. And so you've got these lots that are, you know, anywhere from 10,000 square feet to maybe even some are almost a half an acre in some cases. But they do have this ranch footprint that goes property line to property line. And so, you know, I think that is something that, you know, I think that the commission it's going to be, you're going to be challenged with kind of, as you think of those policy considerations, and hearing back from the public, I think is going to help to inform that. But yeah, I think clearly, I mean, and you know, I saw this slideshow presentation before y'all did. I agree with Matt and Brandon's pros on this, if you want to call it a pro. The question is do you consider that a pro or a not, providing additional flexibility? And that's completely up to you as a decision-making recommending body. But I do think that clearly if you go and you drive through West Kaiser, especially Dennis, Sunset, some of those streets that have larger lots with, you know, houses that were built in 1957 or 1960, and they're a large ranch home and there's not a lot of room. Over the years, there's a lot of those properties that actually can't develop because they can't maintain a legal means of access to that new piece of property. And so that's where the middle housing, if you build a duplex on it, whether or not it's attached or detached, you're not dealing with land division. So your access is the same access to the street. So I think it does give certain folks more flexibility of adding units in. And it's tough. Senate Bill 458, like, to be perfectly honest, like, that one I have a lot, I mean, I have had a really hard time with 2001, wrapping my head around it and going, okay, the world's gonna change on us. But Senate Bill 458, I felt like all of a sudden it just like, where did that come from? And that has some potential to create some more issues, I think. So anyway.
And we will talk about that.
I just want us to think about that as a community, because we know that that's an issue. If we want to meet the housing demand for Kaiser, one way to do that is to continue with infill, and having that style considered, detached, is one way to help that, because we do, in our housing study, it's been identified that most of our developed buildable land is in these lots, like 10,000 square foot long lots. I mean, it's something we have to weigh when we consider these changes.
Commissioner Rentz.
Yeah, I don't know if you've really started thinking about how the detached duplexes and Senate Bill 458 and middle housing land divisions, how those all correlate together and what kind of a nightmare that's gonna be for you guys. I have, because I'm on the other side of the table from you. I see detached duplexes as being a nightmare to track in the future. Absolutely, you'll get higher densities,
Yeah.
more flexibility, but it'll be tough.
When you say track, what do you mean by that?
Well, so let's say I've got an empty lot and I come in, I want to build 4 detached quad, right? I want a detached quad. Then I come back and I do a middle housing land division. Well, Shane and Dina, they have to track that those are
4 separate lots.
that those cannot be further divided
Oh, gotcha.
under the middle housing requirements.
Right, and that from henceforth, the code provisions for middle housing are what will apply to them, not necessarily the code provisions for a single-family detached home. You won't be able to add an ADU, again, unless you choose to let that happen. You won't be able to convert one of them into duplex. You won't, you will have to kind of consider them as, that's what they're approved as. Then they got divided, but they're still middle housing. They're still part of a quadplex. They're not any longer they're not all of a sudden something else. And so you will have to track that somehow. You'll have to have, whether it's a note on the deed or something in your permitting system or something. And when we get to some of the details of Senate Bill 458, it provides some allowances to do that. So you can do it, but it will be work. I mean, so that's another thing to think about, because you may, and I'm not trying to sort of recommend one or the other, but you may have more of that if you allow detached than attached. So it's another thing to think about. I think it does just generally provide more options and flexibility, including in some of the infill situations you talked about. So I always think of flexibility as a good thing. So that's why we called it a pro down here. But yeah, not everybody would say, oh yeah, that's a good thing, that's an advantage. And then it does represent some potential challenges for access to those individual units, partly just because it's kind of spreading them out, and providing less area for the access. So, and then especially if you have the division, you've got to then have easements to provide access, etc. So it's just, there are some complications. It makes it more complicated. So you just have to decide, right? Is that do you want, what's most important in this community? Is it the flexibility and options, or is it some of the challenges that come along with it? So I will also say, just this is a thing that particularly one of our other project managers in the office raises, is that kind of allows somebody to come along and in some ways maybe kind of get around the standards for single family detached homes, because in some ways that's what you're building. If you're coming in with a detached quad or triplex, but you get to divide it later or at the same time via the Senate Bill 458, but you don't have to meet all of the requirements you would meet if you were going through a subdivision process. So that's just another thing to think about, and if that's the case, you want to try to, incorporate some things in your code that address that. So that's kind of the last con that we listed on here. So I'm kind of hearing definitely some concerns about some of the challenges with tracking or administering, with dealing with some access requirements. I'm hearing some support for kind of the added flexibility, especially given some of your land patterns here. Are there any other thoughts on this one, on the detached versus attached? Any other things we need to be thinking about, or preferences, concerns, things you like?
I mean, I think especially with the ranch style where you got lot line to lot line type thing with those houses, access becomes a big challenge, especially for the people in the back. And then you can't require at all any parking because they're not gonna be able to access it. So then you have much more congestion on the streets. We've seen a trend specifically in Keizer in the last 6 or 8 months where a lot more cars are getting stolen, a lot more cars are getting broken into, catalytic converters getting stolen, stuff like that. And so I think that's just a note that I'd like to throw out there, because I think that, it takes away from sort of people in single-use vehicles and stuff like that, but I think it reduces their flexibility. And when we're talking about a community that has very little job opportunities for people to actually work and live in the same area, I think taking a holistic view of that is a big issue. So I just kind of want to throw that one out there.
Okay. Yeah, other thoughts?
I'm with you. I think as the first con, the others, the regular challenges, city will deal with them, and but the access, and that's what makes that parking requirement issue and clarity of it so important. Again, you're basing the number of units on the lot size or potentially not the number of units, and that what's gonna happen is that some of those cars, every unit is gonna need 2 parking spaces. There are at least 2 people are gonna be living there, right? So if they don't have any place to park, they're gonna be parking on the street, invitation for theft, vandalism, traffic, potentially fire problem. So that's why the parking issue becomes very important and should be based on number of units, not the size of the lot. You can build 6 units on a 3,000 foot lot, and that's gonna require a lot of parking space. So other than that, I think there's more pros to this than there is con, but that should definitely be addressed.
Okay, and the one thing I would just note is that you still can require 4 spaces for that quadplex. And if they can't accommodate that on the lot because they don't have enough space in the front setback area, you don't allow parking in that area, then they wouldn't be able to get the 4 units on there. If there's no ability to park in the back and there's not enough space in the front, then you wouldn't have to allow that. So I would just kind of add that to the mix. I don't disagree that if there are more than 4 cars there, then you are going to get more parking on the street. I mean, that's definitely a potential outcome, so.
So I had a question, and maybe this is actually for the planner. So, these ranch-style homes that are basically up to the setbacks, if 2 neighbors got together and they wanted to build a road between their 2 setbacks and have access on both of their lots in the back end, is that allowed?
Yeah, I mean, we encourage that with land divisions. There's a lot of times when folks come in and I say, hey, you should talk to your neighbor, because if you guys went in together, you could both divide your property and it could be mutually beneficial. It doesn't happen very often. Just practically, you have a lot of times in established neighborhoods, you have folks that have lived there for a really long time, and they're not happy that the neighbor sold the house and somebody's coming in and dividing it. So, I mean, it takes people being willing to work together to do that.
But it is allowed.
Yeah, it's
If you could take
absolutely.
those-
The difference is that currently, the only way you can go and build another unit on a property that you own is by dividing it first. Unless you're building in a detached accessory dwelling unit, which we allow outright now. We've allowed it for a long time, but standards have changed over the last few years. And so when you create a new lot, then that is subject to the same access standards and utility provision standards that any other lot is held to. And so we have a specific standard that says if you're doing an access easement, because it's the only way you can divide the property and you can't put in a full-blown public street because it doesn't serve enough units, we would allow you to do an access easement. It's got to be at least 20 feet wide. It's got to be paved. It's got to have no parking signs. It's got to have a turnaround if it serves more than, if it serves 2 houses or more, if it's not just a flag. So there, we have specific standards for that. Difference being obviously with the middle housing stuff, we're not talking about necessarily land division at all. We're just talking about them being able to build additional units.
Right.
So.
Well, and we're not necessarily talking about requiring parking on each of the individual quadplex lots. They could have 4 spots on one and have an easement, right?
Yep,
Correct.
yeah, definitely true. Yep. Gotta have a way to get to the units as a pedestrian, but yeah, you don't have to have a spot with each unit. Yeah. And, if you kind of, like my neighborhood, which admittedly is in Portland, but there's a number of those kind of developments around that neighborhood that sort of predate the current zoning, and they find a lot of different ways to park those units. But often it is, they've got kind of 4 spots up front. Either they're, kind of all facing or backing on the street, or they're on the side and one of the units is up there. So there's lots of different ways you can do that in terms of some shared parking where you don't need to drive back to the unit behind. You got a short walk, but, so there's a lot of different configurations. I think between now and the next meeting, we will send you some graphics that show, because we did some, I mentioned these test fits back during the middle housing model code process. And we did some test fits that showed some different parking configurations. At that time, I guess we were looking at, we did those for the model code process and also for the city of Eugene, because they were thinking about this issue then as well. And so we showed some different configurations of attached and detached and how that might look on certain size lots and how the parking could shake out and stuff like that. So that might be helpful. We'll send those out to you as a follow-up to this meeting, just so you can, because a lot of times, it's really helpful to get a better visual picture of this. So I'll make sure I do that, and if I don't remember right away,
I think it's a great idea.
And tell me. So, yeah.
So I just want to pause for a second. We're about an hour and a half in. Everybody doing all right? Do we need to take a 5-minute? Everybody good? Because we're about halfway through the presentation. You guys good?
I'm fine. Yeah.
Okay, let's roll.
Yeah. All right, cool. And I would say we're a little more than halfway just in terms of content, but yeah.
Just trying to be nice.
I appreciate it. Definitely. Thank you. So one of the other places where you have some flexibility is around standards associated with cottage clusters. So there are some, prescriptive standards in the legislation in terms of how these are defined, and then also in the administrative rules. But then there are a number of design standards that are kind of optional. So through that middle housing model code process, we develop some specific standards that you can choose to adopt, and to some degree you can choose to vary. So that's kind of where your options come in with the cottage cluster as a specific housing type. So one, you can allow those from the get-go on either one lot, all the cottages are on one lot, or the cottages are on their own lots with some shared spaces or some areas as part of the development and shared ownership, or where there's easements, or however the builder developer figures that out. So that's one option. With Senate Bill 458, ultimately you have to allow those to be divided up, but you can sort of start out with them that way. That's an option, and build those code requirements into your development code. So that's one place. You have some flexibility in terms of, as part of a cottage cluster development, do you put a maximum beyond what is allowed by the state in terms of the number of cottages within a cluster, or the number of clusters within a cottage cluster development? So, I think when I think of these, I mostly think of, it's like one cluster. It looks like what's up on the screen there. But a cottage cluster development could have like 4 of those things, right? It could have multiple clusters. In each case, you've got a group of these cottages around this common area, but you could have more than one cluster. And so you can decide, no, we want to limit that to 1, or we want to allow more, or, we want to place this upper limit on that. There are some sideboards around kind of courtyard specifications in terms of the amount of space you have to require at a minimum for a courtyard area per unit. But you can include some additional design standards related to how the landscaping is sort of allocated among impervious surfaces, pavement versus plantings, or the distance from the courtyard to the cottage. So there's a number of things where there are some kind of model standards. You can choose to implement those or not. And some of them you can vary if you want to make them a little more permissive than what's in the model code. There you can allow for, but you don't have to, community buildings as part of a cottage cluster. So it's basically a building where you've got a meeting space and maybe some kitchen facilities, but nobody lives in it. It's just for people who live in the cluster to gather and hang out, or you can have dwelling space in it if you want people to be able to have guests come and stay there. So you can allow for those things, and there aren't quite the same restrictions on the size of those. Unless they can be used at some point as a dwelling, then they have to meet the same size limitations. But there's some flexibility on that. There's also some flexibility on size requirements. You've got some limitations on that in terms of the footprint, but you can lower the total square footage. You've got to allow, you can't allow them to be more than 900 square foot in terms of the footprint, except you get 200 square feet for parking exempt from that. Beyond that, you could apply a maximum size per cottage or a maximum average size for all the cottages. So there's some flexibility there. You can apply some standards around issues related to how you design and allocate parking within the site. That's different than the number of spaces you require, but where they are, how many are grouped together, whether you require buffering or screening around those. You've got some choices there. And so there's some example language related to most of these things in the model code, and you can kind of look at that and pick and choose which of those things you want to apply to cottage clusters here. And again, some of those standards, you can vary them as long as you're not making them more restrictive than what's in the model code. So, that was a lot of talking, sorry about that for one slide, but any Comments, questions, thoughts about that? You like the idea of kind of some additional design standards or fewer design standards? Or not sure until we bring something back to you to react to, which is a fair response as well.
I guess the question I have for Shane, how many 7,000 square foot lots have we got in the inventory?
I don't know off the top of my head, but we have quite a few at 7,000 square feet. I think that
Or is it 30,000 it's 30,000 for cottage clusters, right?
Right now, I
Yeah.
think that's what
and that's what our code requires right now.
Oh, got it.
So, and there's a reason why, I would say there's probably a reason why the city has not had any cottage cluster developments done since we adopted those standards back in 2014, I think, 15, I don't know. It was quite a long time ago that we adopted those standards to allow for cottage clusters. But I had several developers, well, not several, I had probably 5 in all of the years come in and look at it. And ultimately, all of them decided to go with a standard division of land. Primarily because we didn't really give a density bonus. Whereas these middle housing provisions, you don't have to worry about density anymore, or we can't worry about density anymore. And so that I think that was a big part of it. I think though, the one thing I would say is that I do think one area that y'all should think about and consider is one of the things that Matt hit on, which was, do you allow multiple clusters or things like that? For the most part, our land base, I don't know that you have the capacity or the size of properties where you're going to be getting a whole lot more than 4 or 5 units. And I think you have to have at least 4, right, Matt? Isn't that what the state rule says?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that, realistically, the cottage cluster option is going to be the one where you've got that 10, 12, 15,000 square foot lot, and maybe they go, oh, I could do a cottage cluster and have some little houses in the backyard. Basically, it's like ADUs, but a little bit bigger and more of them. So, I mean, I don't see that, you don't have the properties that you're going to have like these massive cottage cluster developments because they're going to be on separate pieces of property. I mean, realistically. So, but there's quite a few lots that are in that 7,000 to 10,000 square foot range. That was a super common standard of lot sizes in the 90s, which is when a huge portion of our housing was developed. If you think Meadows, you think Golden, you think the other Leiden developments in West Keizer, a lot of those are in that range of 7,000 to 10,000 square feet, just the lots are. But the reality is there's also houses on them that were built in the 90s.
Right.
And there's not that much usable space in the rear yards unless somebody's going to rip down a house and build a cottage cluster development. And for the most part, we know house values in Keizer. So, I think cottage clusters, honestly, are still going to be a challenge for folks to build on lots that have existing homes on them, because to fit 4 additional units and provide the courtyard and provide the parking, there are going to be, just the way that our land base is set up, there's definitely places it could work, but I think that's going to be less common than it would be conversion to duplex or triplex, just personally. That's what I would say.
So the question, I think, Matt, you had was, do we want to require more design standards? Is that? Okay.
Yeah, and I would agree with what Shane said. I think it's interesting even before House Bill 2001 was passed, and when this form has been around for a while, but you don't see much of it being built because there are, I think, challenges to building it. When I've gone out and talked to people about it in a lot of communities around the state, they kind of love the idea of it. They're like, oh, that's super cool. I'd love to move into that, especially when I got older. I don't want to take care of a big house or a big yard. But there's definitely some challenges to developing them. And there's challenges that Shane described, and then there's just, in most communities, not the development code that supports it. So they're not going to be the thing you see a ton of. I think you'll probably see other forms of middle housing before you see these. Frankly, you'll see townhouses before you see anything else.
Right.
I would just say, if we don't see them don't have to spend that much of our energy picking over the code for something that is very unlikely to happen and be utilized
Yeah.
in Keizer.
I mean-
think from a build perspective, townhomes or triplexes, that would be the better, that would be what developers would do over this, just for the cost to build.
Yeah, I think most of the time, this is kind of a niche form of housing, and it's more often going to be developed by somebody who owns a piece of property and they want to have some additional units on there, and they like the idea of this form of housing, so.
Shane, remind me, does the current development code for cottage clusters allow land divisions?
No, I don't believe so.
You'll see more.
Yep, no, yep. I think it'll be interesting to see what the mortgage industry does also, because I still think there's a little bit of, well, sorry, that's totally off topic, but I have some major questions about that on the lag and how people pay for homes and mortgages work. I think these middle housing types, it's going to be new for the mortgage companies to figure it out too. So, I mean, I think that'll, as far as Senate Bill 458 goes, so.
Okay, so I did hear maybe we don't want to spend a lot of time worrying about a bunch of standards for these if we don't think there's going to be a lot of them. We might come back to you with here's a subset of standards that might make sense to consider, and then you can tell us, yeah, we like those and maybe tweak these a little bit. Does that sound like a fair approach? Okay. All right, I'm going to jump to the next one. So here's a couple things to think about. These are both along the lines of you could allow for more, or you could be more permissive than what the state requires you to do. So back to the lot sizes. You don't have to allow triplexes on 3,000 square foot lots or even below 5,000. You could, though, choose to do that. You could, I'm not sensing a groundswell of support for this so far, but you could require even fewer parking spaces than what the state administrative rules require. For townhomes, there's some basic design standards you can require, including some that have to do with sort of the design of the facade, like having certain features on there. You don't have to do that. You can take that approach, but require even fewer features. So, requiring less sometimes is actually being more permissive or flexible. And there are some, as I think I mentioned earlier, standards in the model code that you can apply to plexes and townhomes related to entry orientation or window coverage or parking, access and location, but you don't have to apply those. Now, I would say that if you're applying something similar now through your multifamily design standards, you want to continue to apply some of those basic things to triplexes and quadplexes, then that might be a starting point for us in terms of looking at amendments to your code. But again, you don't have to. So you could be even a little more permissive and not apply those same requirements to triplexes, quadplexes, townhomes. So those are all options for you. And there are some communities around the state who are taking that route. And there's others who are saying, no, we're going to pretty much stick with, what we need to do. We want to support this, but we're not ready to go above and beyond. So that's a choice for you guys. That's a policy choice. And then along those same lines, you could allow for ADUs to be, you could allow for an ADU with a duplex or with a triplex or with a quadplex or with a townhome. So you could do that. You're not required to do that, but you could choose to do that if you were to choose to do that. So right now, you need to allow an ADU in conjunction with a single-family detached home, right? And then you've got some specific standards that need to be applied in that case per the state, and your code already does that. You're already good. If you were to choose to allow an ADU in association with a duplex or a triplex or a quadplex or a townhome, you could put some additional sort of restrictions on that. You could say, well, we're going to allow that, but not as a detached unit, only as an attached or an internal unit or something like that. So if you wanted to allow ADUs in addition to those middle housing types, you could do that, but you could apply some additional standards to that. So those are a couple other ways in which you could vary from the state guidance on this. So Any thoughts on any of those?
Just why wouldn't you allow ADUs? Just,
I mean, it just would be, denser, like more units on a lot,
as long as they provide
But yeah,
Space.
But you could, I think in that case, you could require them to have another parking space if it's on a duplex lot or a triplex lot. I want to check on that. I don't want to like totally quote you on that one, or quote me. But yeah, I think that would be the reason not to. So, any other thoughts on either kind of being more permissive and or the ADU question, which is kind of a related question?
I think that, allowing up to so many units on a very small lot is going to be enough of a culture shock. Throwing ADUs into that mix is going to be even more. That being said, I think Shane always tends to want to lean on the allowance side, but I'm not quite there yet on this particular one personally. I just think do you create an allowance for the sake of creating allowance, knowing that the practical applicability of it is almost non-existent? I just don't know that there's the need to go through that process personally.
And
Am I
I will
wrong?
say, no, I will say to all of you that honestly, this particular thing with ADUs was actually news to me, because it's been so drilled into my brain over the last couple years that thou shalt allow an ADU on every lot that a single family is allowed on.
Right.
Period. You have to. I thought we had to no matter what, to be perfectly honest. So there is an option there that I really wasn't aware of as we were going through that, because it's basically you're saying, okay, I'm choosing middle housing or an ADU. The only thing I will say, just the flip side of from a policy consideration place, over the last several years, I think we've seen maybe 12 ADUs built in the last 4 to 5 years, something like that, maybe a dozen. So a lot of those ADUs that were built were on those larger lots that are kind of primed for infill but had access challenges and or a really nice house that somebody didn't want to mess with. So some of those folks may already have an appetite for providing additional housing stock and providing additional units. So if they already had an ADU, I guess that would be the other piece that you may have they might have to get rid of that ADU if they want to implement middle housing. So that's just one thing, like because I've just started wrapping my mind around this, because I didn't even think this was something up until, a couple weeks ago when Matt and I talked about it, and I was like, oh.
Well, if it's existing though, it's essentially grandfathered in, right?
That's an interesting question it raises. I'm going to think about that one a little more.
It becomes a weird, I would say.
I'd say if they have an existing
sort of,
ADU
except
and they
that
want to do a
the
triplex.
This is where I can't put our city attorney on the spot, but remember the primary use of that zone
Right.
is the single family home, and it's the single family residential deal, right? Well, this is middle housing is developing a new use. So so arguably in code structure, some people might want to define middle housing as its own definition. So single family housing is defined here, middle housing is defined here, accessory structures, accessory dwelling units here, right? And then you list what's an allowed use. So if you're developing middle housing, you're developing middle housing, which means it needs to fit in that definition. So depending on some of those policy considerations, like if detached plexes were allowed or not, if detached plexes were allowed and it was a detached ADU in the backyard, wouldn't matter, because you could just call it a detached plex. Right. But if you didn't allow the detached, I'm not sure, they wouldn't have to get rid of it, because generally a pre-existing non-conforming use can continue to be for as long as it is, and you can rebuild it and all of that. But what they would be doing is coming in saying to Shane, hey, I want to do this middle housing project and build a triplex. Okay, you can do that because it's middle housing, which means you're no longer a single family home and detached ADU. you're now doing a triplex, which is a different use of the property. And it's kind of splitting hairs, and I don't know that I win that in a court of law, but I think there's some kind of weird stuff that starts to pop up with that. Sorry.
That's okay. That's a good one, I think, for checking in with DLCD on. I mean, I think the tenor of the conversation around that issue during the development of the rules was that in particularly medium cities where you have to allow a duplex, and it's the same case for your city too, but where you have to allow a duplex on any lot where you allow a single family detached home, it was very clear that you have to allow a duplex. You don't have to allow a duplex and an ADU.
Right.
I mean, that was clear. In this case, on a certain size lot, you have to allow a triplex. On another certain size lot, you have to allow a quadplex. You don't have to allow a triplex and an ADU on a 5,000 square foot lot. You don't have to allow a quadplex and an ADU on a 7,000 square foot lot. Can you allow for a triplex, a conversion of a single family house into a triplex if there's already an ADU in back? That's the thing I think that Shane's raising, and I'm not sure. And we should.
That was what I was.
Hold on a second.
Yeah.
City Attorney.
So, Chair Lawyer, I was trying to figure out what your question was. If the question is, can you change the code and say you can't have a detached ADU? Or is that part of the question? Because I would say, yeah, you can do that, and you're not grandfathered in if you haven't built the ADU yet.
Right. Yeah, we kind of went
Yeah.
seven different directions, so I don't actually remember what my original question was.
Well, yeah, I mean, the question is about being grandfathered in, so it depends on what the facts are. And then towards the end there, I saw what Shane was getting at, but
Well, I think my point was if it's an existing ADU, right?
an existing ADU.
It's an existing ADU, and it's 10,000 square foot lot, existing ADU on the back half of the 10,000 square foot lot. They decide to cut it up, and now you've got two 5,000 square foot lots. They could build a triplex with an existing ADU that was already there.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
I would say no, because then you're creating a non-conforming use.
Correct. I was just asking the question.
I do think that's a really.
It's a tough one. I'm not positive, but I would have concerns about it.
I'm just thinking if somebody's already got an ADU in the back 40 and
Right.
all of a sudden they want to go to a duplex or triplex, well, a
I
duplex
think
they'd
it
be able
really
to,
depends on how
right?
you write the code.
I'm sorry?
It depends on how you
Exactly.
write the
Right.
code.
And I think that actually, I mean, it does get a little bit crazy. And whenever we get into pre-existing non-conforming uses or the grandfathering rule, the wheels always come off. It always is crazy.
That's fair.
But I think actually though, Chair Lawyer, I think what you're raising is a really good point. And I think that what would be helpful for me as kind of the staff person and who's going to kind of be working with these guys on some of the draft language is what are the feelings around that at the planning? I mean, is the feeling, hey, if there's already a detached ADU there that's been there for the last few years, it's functioning, then that should be allowed to stay. I think we could work on language around that to carve out how we could make that work along with this middle housing provision. I mean, and that would be helpful to me.
And that's only required if we choose to not have detached duplexes and triplex and quad. Because if we have it allowed detached, then it wouldn't matter, because that would just be considered a.
I believe that, in my opinion, I believe that would be true. Obviously, the reality there would be is that detached ADU would be one of those units.
Yes, right.
So you
It
wouldn't
counts.
get that additional bonus unit, which
Right.
is kind of the additional flexibility.
And the size of our current ADUs detached are limited.
750 square feet.
Right, so they're very small.
Pretty small.
Units already anyway, footprint wise.
Yeah.
Sorry to cut you off, I saw that shit. Okay.
Yeah, so any additional just thoughts on that? Good idea, bad idea?
Yeah, Shane, I know you just started wrapping your head around this section. What are your thoughts on allowing ADUs on these lots under a conditional use?
That's interesting.
I mean,
We could set up all sorts of criteria.
It's true.
Yeah, I think if it was ADU in addition to triplex in addition to quadplex, in addition to duplex on those lots where you need to allow those middle housing forms, I think, yeah, you could do that.
And-
as long as the approval criteria are clear and objective and any standards are clear and objective.
Yeah,
It can't be a discretionary approval process. Because it's still housing, any.
Well, but even though we don't have to allow ADUs?
Maybe not. I want to sort of, definitely the standards need to be clear and objective. The approval process,
Yeah.
I want to check on that.
And I think it gets difficult because when you call it an ADU, then you're subject to that ORS that says you have to allow these things for an ADU, right? I mean, so I think that is something that, I think it's hard, but frankly, I think my answer would be different depending on how Planning Commission chose to approach the detached versus the attached plex kind of policy. I think that would kind of, I think there's a different way of looking at things. So, yeah. Especially just from some of the concerns that I'm hearing, like around parking. ADUs, you can't crack parking. Like, that's very clear. An ADU, you cannot require a parking space.
Can you in this section?
In this, under
You
this.
can
scenario.
require, so you can require, you can, ADUs, you can't require a parking space.
I'm sorry, it's been a while since I've done ADUs.
Yeah.
Is it
Generally,
where
that's true.
ADUs are allowed, you cannot require parking? Or you cannot require parking with any ADU?
I do not remember exactly how that language is worded in the statute, so I want to go look at it.
Yeah,
I think that's a fair question.
We had to change our code twice for ADUs, and we had initially adopted a standard that said, hey, if there's no parking available on the street,
Right.
then we're going to require you to provide one parking space, because we felt that was fair.
Right.
And I think we had to turn around like 6 months later and get rid of that because they had come back and modified the standard to say, hey, an ADU, you can't require additional parking for an ADU.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, all that's tied to, you need to allow the ADU on a lot where you
Yep.
allow single-family detached, or where you have single-family detached. And if we're talking about allowing an ADU on a duplex lot where you don't have to allow it, then it might be a different answer.
I see what you're saying.
And that's why
Sure.
I think you're asking the question, and that's why I would want to check with DLCD on that. They might tell me, check with their city attorney, or you might want to do that regardless, but I think that would be a good question for us to pose to them. Again, I think I mentioned earlier, they have these forums, and we have the ability to kind of check in with them, and they don't always know right away, but if they have an answer, they'll give us an answer, so.
So I think we're in a position where we allow it with duplexes right now. We don't have to answer the question necessarily right now. If later on down the road, this starts becoming a thing, they can always come back with a text amendment where we could have a discussion about allowing it on triplexes and quads,
Yep.
right?
And I think we all started this with your question about grandfathering. So
Right.
Shane said there was a dozen or so
Right.
people that have these on there, and if we draft language to allow them to continue to have that if they choose to do something, but if we decide not to have, like, if you do a triplex or a quadplex, then there's no ADU.
Right.
We're only trying to serve the people that have built the ADU a few years ago under that
Yeah.
law, and that they have the space and maybe the desire to build a triplex now. They would then now not be able to do it unless they tore down the ADU.
Yeah.
So we're looking at, your original question was,
Yeah.
can we grandfather it in? And I think Shane said there's a way we could probably do it for that select 12 people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on how the code language gets structured and under what parameters would that be allowed.
Yeah.
If the policy, again, back to the policy direction, if the policy direction is to like, no, we don't want to allow ADUs everywhere, but we do in these specific situations, like that would be helpful to know. Because I mean, really, the overarching question is do we want to allow more, or just what we have to allow? I mean, that's really what the question is.
I'm kind of leaning towards a conditional use process that maybe if you've got an extra 1,000 feet above the minimum or something like that, I don't know.
Yeah,
I was trying to think like we're talking about putting a triplex on a 5,000 square foot lot, right? And a quadplex on a 7. So you don't have a lot of footprint for an ADU, even at 750 square feet.
Right.
So I was trying to think like, what would someone do if, let's say I owned one of those triplexes and I wanted to do something, maybe my height isn't at 35 feet and I was thinking about doing something up or, or maybe sectioning off part of the house and saying that's a separate ADU so I could have a renter in there and it all be legal and all that. That's what I was thinking that maybe someone would do, but I can't imagine like just the space. I just don't see how you could have a triplex and put a detached ADU. I'm thinking it would be attached anyway. So like, would we want to not let someone do that if they chose to do that? I guess that's the question. I don't think it would increase it wouldn't change footprint or anything like that. It would just give somebody the option of.
Yeah, and like I said before, my advice or my answer would change depending on the policy on detached versus attached plexes. Because I'm pretty familiar with our land base and what the lots are like in Keizer. And anything that's in the 5,000 to 7,000 square foot range that's that small already, I would say almost everything at that size has a house that's built on it. The house I live in, I have it's a little bit over 5,000 square foot lot. It's a big house on it, I have a small yard. I have a rental house that has a 7,000 square foot lot. To imagine a triplex in that yard is crazy, and that's not a big house. But, if you tore something down or got really creative, you might do that. So I think the more likely scenario is if somebody has a lot and it's a fairly large lot, it's 15,000 square foot lot. It's pretty good sized, but it costs a lot to divide it into two separate parcels with utilities and improvements and all of that. There's an option for them to develop this some sort of a middle housing product, whether or not they do a detached plex or they convert an existing house into an attached duplex or triplex. And maybe it's a 15,000 square foot lot and they get creative and they're an architect and they design something that turned that ranch into a fourplex that's all attached. They still probably have room in the backyard to fit a 750 square foot ADU. So that would be, I think, the more likely real world scenario that would come out. And I think that's kind of the policy level question that I would like to hear. It doesn't have to be tonight, but think about it.
Yeah.
But I think that's kind of that policy level that I'd like to hear from you all is that the route we want to try to go, where if somebody is building that duplex or that triplex and they still have enough room to site an ADU, yeah, we're okay with that. Or if it's like, hey, enough is enough, stick with that.
I think I tend to go with what Commissioner Grants is saying.
Okay.
And if they want to go that route, I think it's a conditional use process.
Sure. Okay,
Because
we
I
can
think that
definitely
gives you the
check into
opportunity
that.
to really look at the standards and go through the process.
I would
very
agree.
thoroughly.
My concern was just shutting out the people that did something a few years ago, and then this law didn't exist, so they couldn't opt on this. And that was the only thing that I was thinking about, those individuals that have the desire, that tried something, and I don't want them to be shoehorned into what they have because they were trying to be progressive a couple years ago and this law didn't.
And I guess I want to press pause. Everybody understand the difference between a conditional use process and an outright permitted use. I don't want to make any assumptions. All right, good.
Yeah, and that's definitely, we could look at that too, building that into the code, if that's something you want to see. Kind of dealing with those folks who have built an ADU and you want to give them some flexibility on what they do with the existing house. I do agree that kind of internal conversions, like that's where you might see more of this happen.
Yeah.
Than tearing something down or building something else separate.
Right.
So after the discussion we've just had on ADUs, does that change our feelings or do we need more discussion on the detached tris and quads now? I mean, how permissive do we want to be?
Not very.
I think detached raises a lot of challenges. I think from an economic perspective, it's a lot cheaper for a developer to do attached units. I know a project I'm working on, it's literally a $2 million difference between apartments versus townhomes.
Oh, yeah.
I think attached, I'm more for attached personally, but are you not?
Well, I mean, you'll get more detached
yeah.
tris and quads.
The access and all those other issues, I think just raises a lot of personal concerns for me. You got fire safety, you got access for the individuals and stuff like that. I don't know.
I bring it up, the detached piece, is because we know that our parcels here, that would be the option, right? Because we know what land we have in Keizer, and we know that if we want to develop and have more people in Keizer, then detached would be what we would have to do, or we should do to have that happen. If we don't want to meet the growth that we see happening, then being more restrictive on that. And I understand the piece, but I will say this isn't new, right? What's going on here is not like, Oregon didn't just come up with this and it doesn't exist anywhere else. There's a lot of places that have struggled with this or have come to this road way before we have. So I think the fire department will find a way, to figure out how to be safe and maintain people's security or, safety. I guess the question is, do we want to be more?
Well,
Do we want to have more development and make it easier for people to develop some of these land that exist, or do we just, because if we keep it attached only, it's going to be, because that's what, with the ADUs, you can have an attached ADU and it could be any size, right?
60-40 split.
Yeah, 60-40 split.
So it is dependent on how big the main house is.
Yeah. And we've had 12, in however many years, ADUs, because 750 square feet is really small. So you're not going to see a whole lot of people do that. I don't think we want to rent in those things.
Detached or detached ADUs or triplexes and quads?
Right now it's detached ADUs and quads.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, I lean more towards being flexible and allowing the builders to figure out how to put the units on their lot, and they're going to do what's most economical for them, but maybe we have language that makes sure that there is an easement and there's parking, and, so can we kind of guide by some standards while still allowing them to do what's best economically for building?
Yeah, and I think you'll end up with more fee simple ownership too. I'm sure.
Or what?
More fee simple ownership. So you can get a mortgage on it.
Yeah. Yes, right. That part is more clear cut. But what I would envision happening though, just based on some of the land that I see here, the detached piece will just be so you don't have to connect the quad or triplex to the existing home. And those, if they build a triplex, it will probably be connected because that is the less expensive option to do. It will be building that behind a house that exists already and not having to attach it. That's probably what you're going to end up seeing happening. You won't see the picture where you have 4 units around. I would, unless the lot was big enough, but just based on what I see, I would see that not probably happening. It would be existing home and whatever the new structure is attached, and they would be separate from each other. That would what I would imagine happening.
Yeah, because we talk about the cottage clusters, they can't pencil those out to make it feasible to build. So why would detached units be any different? So we know they're probably going to go with attached, but there's still the option for these unusual property layouts for a detached.
Okay, so I think maybe in my own mind, we're kind of conflating two issues here.
Okay.
The question you had was attached or detached triplexes and quads, correct?
Yeah.
And so but now we're talking more ADUs. So maybe I'm the only one confused here, but I think we're talking about a couple different things.
Well, I thought Shane didn't really want to talk about ADUs until he knew if we were leaning towards allowing detached.
Detached.
Was that true,
tries and
Shane?
quads.
So when I'm looking for kind of that policy level look from Planning Commission, what I'm kind of wanting to hear or to understand is at that policy level, because you can create the policy of if you want to allow an ADU in addition to whatever middle housing is allowed on a lot.
Detached, or does it matter?
It's up to them. So whether or not it was attached or a detached, right now we allow both an attached and a detached ADU. Like you have either option, but you can only do one in a regular lot, unless you're in the River Cherry Overlay District, and we'd let you do one of each. So the policy question is we know we have to allow more housing types than what we've historically allowed, which has basically been single-family homes and an ADU. Sometimes they look a lot like a duplex that's just a little bit off balance because one side is bigger than the other if they do it attached. Sometimes it looks like a home and a little cottage in the backyard. So really the question is do we want to allow these new middle housing types that, again, there's this big question on if we want to allow the middle housing types to be that kind of standard, what we're used to seeing as a duplex, which is 2 units, they're attached at a common wall and it's one building, or one building that has 3 units, or one building that has 4 units. Now, clearly, the massing of those buildings gets larger the more units you add to it. But the question is, okay, if we're going to allow those and an ADU, and then the other one that kind of you guys started talking about is
Detached with a.
whether or not you want to allow that kind of classic element of a duplex that's 2 units within one building, a triplex that's 3 units within one building, or you want to allow this detached plex concept, which says, hey, I've got this big lot, here's the house sitting out front, we'll call that one of the plexes, and I'm going to build another plex in the backyard. And so I have 2 houses that are called a duplex, or 3 houses called a triplex, or a house and a duplex that's called a triplex, or a house and a triplex that's called a fourplex. So there's a ton of things that could end up being developed, but the real question is, do we want to allow more than that, what we have to allow by the state statute? And really the more is the ADU or not to ADU or not ADU, I guess, that is the question.
And also,
Yeah, I would
the
say
more
no
is-
on the ADUs, because then you're getting too dense and too much parking hassle and all of that. So that seems
I
pretty.
guess my question
And I-
is this something that has to be decided tonight?
No, I think we're just looking
So,
for
'cause
any.
I thought we were
want
listening to a
direction, though.
presentation.
Well,
We're
but-
gonna make decisions at another time.
But to be fair, I think as they're developing, because what we're going to see
It'll
next
help
is a draft of the code, and I think
Yes.
that what I understood was Shane wanted some guidance specifically on the attached or detached triplex quad piece, so that they can bring some sort of a formulation of a code to us in January. So to answer your question specifically, no, we don't have to provide a recommendation, but I think Shane was asking for it, which is why
As much as anything, kind of that general feel. I mean, I think the ADU one, I think I heard that, maybe the conditional use kind of thing with certain parameters, and I think we can work some of that out. We need to talk with the state a little bit and see. But I think that gives me enough on the ADU element. But yeah, I felt like I was hearing kind of like a 50-50 split in Planning Commission on detached versus attached plexes. We can put a pin in it because we got plenty of other sections to bring back to
Yeah.
you guys.
I think let's put
Just real fast.
And
And
also,
after we
this
see
is
the
a
survey,
question
yeah.
we're asking in that online survey.
Yep. Right,
And
okay,
so we'll see what we hear. from
We'll
folks
stop
who
asking for guidance
participate in that, and, I mean, I heard kind of a number, as Shane said, I heard a number of folks say, hey, it's good to have the flexibility. Let's provide some additional flexibility. There, the more, I think, is more forms, more physical forms of that type of housing. Not more units, just more physical forms. And then also, there's going to be some challenges, particularly if some of those lots get divided up through the middle housing land division process. So I think, this has been helpful. We don't have a definitive guidance, but it's okay.
All right. So we've lost one commissioner. I think, should we recess for 5, give people a chance to stretch, get a drink, maybe something else?
And we'll just note that in terms of the remaining slides, I've got one more on options. So, and then the others are kind of more like just presenting information about the SB 458 considerations, the survey, which will go pretty quick, and then just next steps. So like substantive stuff, I don't have a ton more.
Okay, well, let's just
and
roll then.
I'm not saying we shouldn't take a break, but I'm saying, I don't think it'll take too much longer. Fair enough? Okay. So kind of the last one we had on policy options relates partly to, and I talked about this earlier, so in terms of design standards, you've got some things in the model code that you can apply, and beyond that, if you want to apply some alternatives, some different design standards that relate to the design of the building primarily, you can do that. It's just that if you do that, you have to demonstrate that those standards will not cause unreasonable cost and delay. And we had a meeting similar to this earlier today with the city of Cornelius, like right before this. It's not why we were late, but we did finish that meeting up at 4:30 and got right on the road anyway. And we had somebody from DLCD at that meeting, and one of the things he said was, you know, there might be some alternative design standards where it's hard to make the case that they do not cause unreasonable cost and delay. And he said there's a difference between unreasonable cost and cost. It's okay to apply a standard that adds a certain amount of cost if it's meeting other community objectives, and that is a little bit of a fuzzy line between cost and unreasonable cost. But his point was, don't like necessarily rule this out if you've got some good reasons for wanting to apply some design standards. But if it's clear that it's going to cause an unreasonable cost and delay, and I can't think of great examples offhand, but then probably don't go there. But if there's some, you know, if we look at, for instance, your multifamily design standards, and we see some standards that we think we could potentially apply to triplexes and quadplexes that are a little different than what's in the model code, but they don't seem like they're going to be significantly more costly, then that's something we could look at. And I think that's the question here is if we're seeing some stuff like that, should we look at some alternative standards? Would that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, you don't have to tell us like which ones, but I think it'll just help us if you're sort of open to that.
Yeah.
And then we can give you some feedback on these we think would be reasonable, these probably not for triplexes or quadplexes or townhomes. So, okay, cool. The other thing, which isn't a thing we really need feedback on, it's just kind of a note, is that we will look at your comprehensive plan policies just to make sure they seem to be in sync with the middle housing requirements. We may recommend some additional policies. You don't have to adopt additional policies. You have to make sure that you don't have things in your comp plan that are conflicting with HB 2001 or the OAR. But we might find some things where we think, hey, it might be useful to like add additional policy foundation. And then you guys can tell us, no, we don't like that. Or you might look at your comp plan and say, hey, how about updating this policy or that, adding that policy? So that's just kind of a heads up. And the other thing we can do is if there's standards you apply to single family detached housing, we can kind of tailor those standards where appropriate or applicable. So I'm just kind of putting that out there. So this one's a little more information, but they're just kind of giving you a heads up on other things where you've got some flexibility. So any questions about that one? Does that all make sense? Cool, okay. So a little bit more on Senate Bill 458 and kind of what's in that portion of the code audit in terms of things that we generally are going to recommend or have already started to recommend. So one, adding some definitions for a number of terms, including middle housing land division. Also, you'll see some language in there about the middle housing parent lot. That's kind of the lot you start out with before you divide it. And then the child lots or the three-solding lots. And so we think it's kind of useful to make that distinction in your code just so it's clear when we're talking about these land divisions, what we're talking about, the parent lot versus the child lot. So that's just a general recommendation. Probably going to need a new application type for these land divisions because they are, the legislation indicates these are not land use decisions. So they can't be a type 1 decision or a type 2, or they need to be something else. So we're gonna have to create a new application type for these middle housing land divisions, and the same thing with expedited land divisions. The procedures for these provisions are laid out in statute, in the ORS, and you can just refer to the statute for these, but you may want to, and we're generally recommending to folks that you actually incorporate those procedures into your code. So when somebody comes in to do this, they don't have to go look at the statute. And when you're reviewing this, you're not looking at the statute all the time, it's actually in your code. And then adding references and elsewhere in your code to refer to that where necessary. So these are all these kind of general recommendations for how we're recommending Kaiser and other communities comply with or address these middle housing land divisions. So any questions about any of those? Generally makes sense? Okay. And then the other things to think about, I talked about this earlier, and you all raised this issue, is just the need to track these things. So there does need to be some mechanism to track them. And again, the Senate bill provides some language around the ability to do that, but then you have to decide how. So we already kind of talked about that, don't need to talk about that too much more. The other thing is sort of the order in which the land division is applied for and approved. It can occur before or concurrent with building permit, plating, and/or development. And we generally recommend requiring the building permit prior to the land division, in part in terms of thinking about making sure the improvements that need to be made are going to be made prior to issuing the building permit. Now, doesn't have to be the building permit, it could be occupancy, it could be something else. You have some options. You don't need to decide on this now. But there is some flexibility on kind of the timing, the sequence of the approval of the land division versus building permit, plating, et cetera. So I don't know, it's getting late. I don't know if we want to go into too much detail on that, but I'm just kind of raising it as an issue where you have some options. And I would say, if you like want to sort of think about that some more, definitely read that section of the memo, and then, we can talk about it some more later. And then there's been some questions just around like easements for shared services within the site, utilities, parking, et cetera. And as those questions have come up and we've started to talk to DLCD, we still have a little bit of uncertainty about that. So we're still kind of figuring some of that stuff out. Because with HB 2001, DLCD adopted a set of administrative rules. With SP 458, they haven't had the same time to be able to do that, frankly, because cities have to comply with that by the same deadline. So they're giving us guidance, and you all guidance, as we go along, but there aren't the same set of administrative rules to fall back on. So that's why some of these things are still a little bit up in the air, and we're just trying to give you the best guidance we can, but in some cases we're still having to get guidance from others. So I'm just kind of putting that out there. But there's still a few things where I feel like every week somebody asks us a question, and then we ask DLCD a question if we don't know the answer, and then they tell us the answer, or they say, we got to think about that. So
Just gives Shannon a lot of room for interpretation, right?
there you go. Sometimes they tell us to go ask the city attorney. So, they give, Shannon gets more power that way too. So, so those are some of the things we highlighted in that portion of the memo, the SB 458. And we talked about a number of other things earlier, but any questions about any of that while we're here tonight? I'll probably punt them to Brandon if I have to. No, let him off the hook. Okay. All right. All we have left to talk about really is the survey. We wanted to talk about this a little bit. And then next steps. So survey's up and running. We did a quick check this morning. We checked.
I think it was yesterday. I don't remember.
Yeah, I think it was yesterday. So as of yesterday, we have 190 views like a pretty good number, like up
Around 150.
150 views and 57.
Yeah, around 50 survey responses.
Yeah, so to me, like, given that we launched it like right kind of on a holiday weekend, not too bad. I would say you want to like, good idea to kind of keep getting the word out to people that it's there, and encouraging people to participate. But I would say off to a pretty good start. Right now, our plan is to keep it open for another 3 weeks till December 21st. You know, that like takes us up to just pre-holidays. I'm gonna guess that most people on Christmas Eve or Christmas morning are not gonna be responding to the survey. Maybe not once they get into the oh my God, I still gotta get a bunch of gifts shopping frenzy that I get into on December 22nd also. So, you know, that seems like a good cutoff date to us. But we should just kind of monitor things in terms of how many responses we're getting, and we can always extend it if we want, but that's kind of the plan. And if you all have looked at it, you know, we kind of tried to summarize some of the same stuff we summarized for you all tonight in terms of, you know, what's HB 2001 say, what do we mean when we talk about these different housing types, what did we find very generally, even more generally than we talked to you about in terms of the audit, what are we trying to do, what's the timeline for all this. And then we asked about a number of the things we asked you all about tonight too. And we also asked about just some general questions about housing, perception of housing needs in the community, preference for certain housing types, demographics, et cetera. But then we also asked some of the questions we asked you around flexibility, attached versus detached, et cetera. So we'll see what we hear. It'll be good input for us, along with the input and guidance from you all as we move forward into the next step. But that's kind of where that is.
About the survey, how many, what do you anticipate, or what's required? How many respondents do we need to respond to the survey? How much data do you need to collect for that, for it to be a valid survey?
So that's a good question. It's really, when people talk about kind of a statistically valid or scientifically valid survey,
Right.
So that's not I will say that's not my area of expertise, but I've managed sub-consultants who work on them enough to sort of know some of what they think about. So there is there's two things. One, there's having a sample size that's up to a certain amount overall,
Right.
and also so that you can sort of say with a certain, you can split it up into subcategories and evaluate the results by income or gender or race or things like that, or sub-area. And I'm going to, just based on what I've seen or heard from those survey experts, well, I'll say another thing second, or before I get to the numbers. So the other thing you need to sort of assess is how well do the demographics of the survey participants match the demographics of your community. And so you need to either A, know that they match up pretty well, or B, be able to disaggregate this. This is a really complicated answer to a fairly straightforward question. B, disaggregate the survey results enough so that you can weight the responses by group so that you get to that similar representation demographically. So those are the two things you have to think about. So typically what I hear is you want to see at least 300 to 400 responses, in part so you can do that parsing out with data and comparison by age group or sub-area or whatever it might be. That's the other thing, is it our responses coming from a geographically even, cross-section of your community. It's just harder to do this and know this with a survey like this because, one, we didn't require people to give us the demographic information. So I'm going to start out saying this is probably not going to be what we would call a statistically valid or scientifically valid survey. It's challenging to create and implement those kind of surveys online,
Right.
unless you require people to answer certain questions in a certain way, which we chose not to do because lots of times people won't do it and then you don't get as many responses. So what I would say is this is going to be, hopefully if we get a large number of responses, I think we'll be able to say, this is useful information. We'll also we did ask people, and a lot of them will tell us, are they homeowners or renters? Are they older, younger, in between? we'll be able to tell you, here's what we heard, and here's how the population of people who participate in the survey tends to vary from your overall population, where we know that. So.
And how are we getting the information out to people to take the survey? Is it just by, like, I mean, obviously I got it from you, so how do other people get it? Like, if I wasn't on this board,
Social media.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we put it, when the survey went up, we put it on our city's Facebook post that same day. It's got sent out to Debbie's interested citizens list, which includes the neighborhood associations, volunteer folks, and a bunch of other people. And that was just the initial last week, right before, well, Dina was heading out of town, so she got it done right before she left. And then we're gonna continue to push that out through social media, hoping that Keizer Times will throw something on there. And that's why I asked all of you, make sure with all of your connections, get the word out. But yeah, and so I'm going to be calling the individual neighborhood associations as well.
Okay.
And the one thing I will just add, and sorry, I don't want to belabor our meeting, it's already late, but you know, I do land use for a living. I've processed most of the partitions and subdivisions in this town in the last like 15 years. And when we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 responses on a land use case, or when 4 people show up to a subdivision hearing, that's considered in my opinion, that's a success because there's public participation. So, like, I mean, I look at it and go, whoa, 57 people responded to the survey. That honestly was pretty exciting to me, because that means that at least there's 57 people that are invested enough to look through the information and answer the questions and to at least participate and let their voice be heard. So, I mean, I know it's not going to be scientific per se, but I really do feel like if somebody's taken the effort to participate, like, that's a good value for all of us to be able to hear. So.
And I would also say, you know, for the other folks who are looking at it, so again, I think Brandon said as of yesterday morning, that was maybe around 150 or a little more. A lot of them are looking at it and going, oh, that's good information, but some of them they're not passionate enough about it, or, you know, willing to devote the time to then go in and do the survey. That tells you something too. It tells you at least those people are looking at it, are like, oh, okay, that's interesting. I don't have a strong enough opinion to go in and fill out the survey, for good or ill.
I completely understand. I just want to make sure, like asking that question, I worked at a university, I was a professor for many years, so surveys are like a big thing.
Yes.
Anyway, I just also would say that if we're going to put some weight to the survey, right, if we're going to make decisions using data from the survey, we want to make sure that we are representing,
yes,
or all of Keizer is represented, not just a small select individual group of people. Homeowners tend to have value and stake in their home, and they might be more energetic and willing to put the 5 minutes into the survey, whereas a renter may not. But the value of the opinion of both of those need to be weighted equally, because some of what we're doing, especially the bulk of this, is going to help those individuals that are renters that can't afford to buy a traditional home in Keizer right now. And so I just want to make sure that we're not secluding that group and saying, well, all of Keizer wants to do this, but we have no way of knowing what that other group did. And I don't know how much was involved in the grant. I mean, I've seen, you know, door to door and actual people because online surveys, they're terrible.
Yeah.
Absolutely terrible when it comes to a quantitative standard. They're terrible because you're going to get such a small group of people to respond to an online survey. So I just want to, just so you know, like we say survey, that doesn't mean that everybody's responding in Keizer and we got a really good sample and we can say, boom, the survey said this and this is what Keizer wants. That could be completely wrong, because we could be targeting what wealthy individuals are going to respond to that survey. They have to have internet, they got computers. I mean, I just don't want to disadvantage. I don't want us to assume that the survey is representing all of Keizer when we know that we have groups of Keizer people that may not be responding to that survey because it's online.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Excellent points. I think it's important to be clear about some of the caveats you mentioned about what we hear from the survey. Right. It's a piece of information, but it doesn't necessarily represent all of Keizer. I think it would be useful at least to look at it and kind of split out maybe the responses from renters versus owners in terms of, how people responded on that means. It's still not going to be scientific, but it's going to be something.
Right, something, and I'm not
Yeah.
trying to say to throw it out of the way, I don't want to mean that
But,
at all, I
yeah.
think it's going to be good, I just don't want us to.
Qualify it.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah,
That's what-
absolutely.
May I-
People getting that idea that it's a survey and this is what it said and
Okay.
this is the answer.
Well, May I just add, could we ask, we have our new diversity community engagement
Yeah.
group, and we could ask them to try to get the survey out to people they know, and maybe at city council announce that survey is available. I mean, we know how hard it is to get people to come to this kind of a meeting, but if we can get it into other meetings where people attend, and consider GUBSR contacted Shane for.
I think the underlying theme here is, I completely agree. We need to get it out there. Maybe we need to talk to Chief Cowan, you get a candy cane and a QR code, I don't know. But we gotta figure out a way to do this and be more representative of everyone in the city, I think.
Yeah, fair enough. And sorry to tell you all about
Exactly. that's
survey
what I-
methodology when you know more than I do.
All right, moving on.
Last slide is just kind of next steps. So we're starting now really on the draft amendments, but we're not too far along. We're getting started looking at the things where we have a pretty good sense of, there are some things like we know we're going to need to change. And so we're already starting to look at that. So we need to keep moving because we got a pretty ambitious timeframe. Talked about the survey. So the next meeting with you all is your meeting in January. So we'll be back with, again, a sort of a first batch of code amendments at that meeting. Some more questions for you, but some more things to react directly to. For meeting number 4 will be in early February at your meeting then. So that'll be kind of a second batch of code amendments. We're going to combine batch back in March, and then moving towards hearings in April. So that's just kind of a quick remaining steps. Sounds like a long ways away, April, but it'll show up really fast.
It's gonna go fast.
Yeah, so thank you for all the time tonight. Any questions about that stuff? Good, straightforward. Probably the most straightforward thing I've talked about tonight. Yeah, so thanks for indulging us and taking the time, and again, apologies for being late. And we will make sure we leave extra early next time, for sure. So, yeah, so thank you.
Sounds great. Thank you very much. All right, we've got one item left on the agenda. Counselor Dram.
I will make it quick. Really, the only thing I want to say is that if anybody knows anybody that's interested in the city council position, to let them know that the letter of interest is due by December 9th. So to replace our city councilor that we lost a couple weeks ago that resigned. So that position will be open, like I said, till December 9th, or the letters of interest will be open till December 9th to get those in. And then we'll be making a decision, I imagine, the next city
December
council
20.
meeting. Yeah, so December 20th, so.
right.
That's the only thing I have.
I'm sorry?
That's the only thing I have.
Great. Commissioner Saldivar, are you good for January 3rd?
Yes.
Do we need to go earlier, or do we want to do January 3rd? Because we've got a couple council meetings between now and then. Verify with Debbie, if we need to do it earlier, we can do it earlier, but.
Six,
Yeah.
this Monday?
Oh, yeah, because we moved it up to the first. I should be able to have you a draft minutes by then, so it will be December 6th, okay? Can you make it?
What day?
December 6th.
December 6th?
So this week, or next,
Monday?
Next Monday.
Yeah,
yes, I can do that. Okay, so not January 6th.
no, that was my mistake, sorry.
Okay.
All right. Anything else for the good of the order? All right, hearing none, we will stand adjourned at 8:40. Thank you very much, gentlemen.